Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you might be in this fine world. You're listening to the Startup Selling Show, talking sales with Scott Sambucci. That's me. Today's episode is a guest episode, and today's guest is Laura Janusik. Laura is a professor, trainer, researcher, speaker, and business consultant. She's a professor emerita at Rockhurst University, and she's won numerous research and teaching awards from different professional and academic associations. And she's one of the world's leading experts in teaching and training about listening. That's the topic for today. So Laura, all of Laura's work is supported by some of the most current research out there when it comes to looking at all of communication, both oral and written, as well as practical and other centered research. Her area of specialty includes listening cognitions and metacognitions. So Laura has a PhD in listening. That's the short of it. She's been the past president of the International Listening Association, and she's published both nationally and internationally. She's got her PhD in communication from the University of Maryland at College Park and an MBA from Rockhurst University in Kansas City. So Laura uses the ECHO listening profile, which we mentioned in the conversation that we just wrapped up, in much of her work with individuals and teams. So ECHO is a scientifically validated instrument to measure an individual and team's listening dominance. And with this tool, you can identify listening blind spots. And so you can identify other people in your team and their listening habits and make sure that you are doing a good job of communicating with them and that they are doing a good job of communicating with you. So listening is a topic that we hear about a lot in sales, like, oh, you need to be a good listener. You need to listen to your clients. You need to listen for needs. You need to listen to what other people are saying. And certainly internally, we always talk about as being a leader of your team, of being a leader of your company, you need to be a good listener. Well, what was really mind-blowing for me in working with Laura individually over the last couple of weeks, as well as in this podcast episode, is that many of these listening skills that we're taught are actually not useful when it comes to understanding what good listening really means. And so in the conversation I just wrapped up with Laura, we spent about 10 or 15 minutes going through the specifics of what does it mean to have a listening strategy? What is the process for listening? How does the brain work? What is the difference between listening and hearing? What are the cognitive pieces of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, and how does listening work? How do we understand the information that we hear, and how do we process that in our brain from a response or no response standpoint? From there, we dove really, really deep into the 4 listening habits, which are connective, reflective, analytical, and conceptual. And we broke down each of those 4 types and defining what they are, helping you identify which of those listening types might be your dominant listening habit, and then also identified some signals that you can use in communication with other people to identify what their listening habit might be so that you can communicate with them more effectively. So the first 15, 20 minutes is kind of building the base for the rest of the conversation, and then the last 20 or 30 minutes is really diving into the specifics of good listening and developing listening habits, as well as applying these different listening skills to specific sales situation. So imagine when you're in that room full of people, you're doing the big meeting, the big demo, and trying to figure out who's really absorbing what you're saying, who's listening to you, who's not listening to you, and why is that person acting a certain way, or why is that person asking certain questions? Well, oftentimes it's because they all have different listening habits. And the more that we can be aware of those listening habits and appeal to each of those listening habits, the more effective you're going to be in your sales conversations and in your team meetings. So that's why I had Laura on the show. I'm excited to have had her on the show. We just finished up with the conversation. In the show notes, you'll see a link to Laura's LinkedIn profile if you're interested in learning more about the ECHO listening profile and how she can work with you individually or work with your team to learn and apply better listening strategies. I would definitely recommend checking her out. She's been great to work with for me personally, so I can vouch for her and her work. I've really enjoyed it and learned a lot about myself and how I can improve my own listening skills, which of course I thought were already stellar. Turns out I got a lot of work to do. So that's it for now. Let's head over to my conversation with Laura Janusik. Remind me the background that you've got there. It's the university where you were teaching, right?
Yes, I'm at Rockhurst University, which is the background there. I'll be there as a full professor through May, and then I am retiring to pursue full-time training and consulting.
Finally, we got another one over to the dark side.
Yeah, that's right. I actually started in the dark side. And I started with junior high school teaching, then went to the dark side, then went back to education. And now I'm going back to the dark side.
Well, I want to ask, like, what subjects did you teach in junior high and high school?
Oh, I was so lucky, Scott, because I got to teach things like theater and broadcasting and English,
Okay.
so that was just so much fun. I absolutely loved it.
And what grade middle school? Because I've heard that's the toughest grade to teach is middle school because of the hormonal
The
craziness
hormonal
that's going on.
changes. Yeah, it was something I did from 6th to 9th grade, depending on the school district that I was in. So, I liked the younger ones there in the junior high better. And then I switched over to high school and I liked the seniors there.
Why did you like the seniors more?
They kind of knew the system of the school. And so they weren't fighting to be top dog or anything. So they were more open to learning because they knew they were the top dog.
They're in the caste system. The caste system was fixed by then. They accepted where they were.
Exactly.
That's funny. I just know myself in both middle school and high school, I was hard to handle. So probably more difficult in high school than it was in middle school.
Yeah, I had a young 14-year-old boy who said to me once, Dr. J, or I was Miss J then, Miss J, I don't even like myself, so I don't know how you could like me.
Oh man,
and
that's rough.
That's insightful.
Wow. Well, hopefully everybody's going to like you and the conversation that we're about to have, because
hopefully
I'm excited to have you on the show. And the reason I'm most excited to have you on the show is for something that I shared with you when we first spoke, which was that I didn't even know that what you did was a thing. I was like, wow, this is a thing. This is amazing. And it makes sense to me as soon as I heard it and as soon as I experienced it. And then I was almost a little bit embarrassed that I didn't know it was a thing. And so what I'd love to start is just for people listening, when people ask you, what do you do? What is the thing that you do? How do you describe that to people? Because I think that would be a great launch point for the rest of our time together.
Okay. I help individuals and groups develop their listening intelligence so they can decrease the bottom line in terms of how long it takes them to do things and increase clarity and comprehension.
So what does that mean from a practical standpoint? What's an example of listening intelligence, and why is it important to like a specific team that might be listening in?
Yeah, listening intelligence really covers a number of different areas. First of all, I think it's really important to say that listening, from my perspective, is a strategy and not a skill. When we typically think of listening, people use the term listening skills, but a skill is just one thing. Listening is a part of communication, and the reason that we as human beings communicate, particularly in business, is oftentimes to meet a goal of some sort. And since communication consists of speaking and listening is part of that goal setting. So for listening intelligence, it means that we are open to different ways to listen to the message and different ways to listen to how other people are speaking to us.
So how did you come to focus in on this area of listening intelligence? Like, it's not something, like I said, like growing up talking about junior high and high school, it's not like, the careers are doctor, lawyer, teacher, listening intelligence expert. How did you come to land on this as your superpower, your area of expertise?
Yeah, and I like that you said listening is my superpower, because I say that often as well. There aren't a lot of us that actually do this, and to be honest with you, it was by total accident. I went to graduate school for my master's to be able to develop curriculum in interpersonal skills. I called them interpersonal skills at that point in time, for corporations. And my advisor, Andrew Wolven, was one of the leading experts in listening in the world. But I told him up front that I didn't want to become a listening person. I didn't know exactly what that meant. It just didn't sound like something that I wanted to do, because I think I thought of listening like everybody else. So, I mean, like, how hard could that be? We're born listening and we listen our whole lives, and we've made it to adulthood listening. So how difficult can it really be? And I was approaching my final year of my master's program, and I made a political decision to take my advisor's course, since he would be writing my letters of recommendation. And it was one of those things where that decision, within the first 2 weeks of his course, it totally changed my life. I went, this is what listening is? Why don't people know that this is what listening is? And I attended a conference by the International Listening Association and recognized that there wasn't a heck of a lot of research being done in the area of listening within the context of communication. So I thought that I could do that. So I automatically fell in love with research and decided to go on for the PhD in that area. And I have indeed become a listening person.
So what was it in that class? What was the trigger? Was there a certain lecture, a certain topic? It was the way that a model that your professor shared that got you from like, holy crap, I thought I was just taking this as a check the box, get some help, to making it the career trajectory for you?
Yeah, it was an earlier piece of research that he had done, where he had critiqued about 5 different listening models that were out there. And at that point, I didn't even understand that listening could be modeled, or there was a process of listening. And looking at these different steps in the listening process and how different researchers approached it really intrigued me, because I then began applying it to myself. Okay, listening isn't really about hearing. We hear with our ears, but we listen with our brain. So what actually goes on with our brain, and how do we make meaning in our brain?
So what is that? What is that property in the brain? How do you define it as being different than hearing? Because I think most of us will use hearing and listening, I think, somewhat interchangeably, though. I think semantically, most of us know, like, okay, I can hear something, or I heard you, versus like, I'm really listening to you. So I think
Right. And
there is some clarity around that. But like, what happens in the brain that makes listening so different than hearing?
Well, actually, 2 things there that I'll address. What I find is interesting is the general public oftentimes will switch around from what the researchers use those 2 terminologies as. So researchers think that hearing is just done with the ears, and it's the physical sound that's actually activating. But the way that the brain works, and I actually took 2 years off to study cognitive psychology, because I figured if I was going to become a listening expert and a listening cognitivist, so interested in the brain part of listening, I better understand what cognitive science says about the brain. And what I stumbled across is that when we hear sounds, they only activate different parts of our brain, but that activation then has to go to the prefrontal cortex, which is where we make meaning. And during that process, we have to call upon what is known as working memory, which replaced the whole short-term memory, long-term memory schema. It's now working memory, which makes sense when you think about it, because what we have to do is we have to take these sounds that are coming in, and we have to match it up in our brain with words that we already know, which is how we're beginning to make that meaning in our brain then. And that's why, you can hear words like, one of my favorites to use with students is triskaidekaphobia. I will guarantee that you have heard that word a million times in your life, Scott. And you're looking at me like I have no idea what triskaidekaphobia means. But it means fear of the number 13. And every Friday the 13th, when you tune into radio or television, somebody is going to say triskaidekaphobia. But because that word wasn't formally in our brain, we just kind of let it go through, and we don't attach any meaning to it until we learn it. And now I guarantee you the next time it's Friday the 13th, you're going to be emailing me saying, Laura, I heard triskaidekaphobia.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's like you sort of store the information that you think is relevant, like a computer, and then you delete the rest of the files.
Mm-hmm.
I often think about that as like my brain is a hard drive. There's stuff that I can't remember anymore because it's just not relevant to me. So like auditorily, right? Stuff, waves come in, the sounds then get processed in the prefrontal cortex, and then that's where the sort of cognition of those sounds turn into meaning for us. Is that the correct way to think about it?
That is the correct way to think about it. And the interesting thing about our prefrontal cortex is it is never activated first. So our senses are activated in other parts of the brain, and then they move to the prefrontal cortex. But the prefrontal cortex, well, that's important because we're beginning to understand the brain more and why people perhaps can't smell different smells, can't taste different things, because the brain is a process. It isn't this 10-pound mass that we carry around in our head. There are actually systems that are going on in our brain that we're only beginning to explore and understand how they work.
Okay. So now we've got this foundation of listening versus hearing, understanding how it works in the brain, at least at the most superficial layer possible. You mentioned about the 5 different listening models. And so if I'd like to dive into, if we can, all 5, if not, that's okay. And do that in context of, if I'm leading a sales team, if I'm running a company, I've got a team of, employees around me. Those are all people that I know I want to listen to, and I want them to listen to me. And then I also think of it from a selling standpoint. I have customers, and I want to listen to them, and I want them to listen to me. So framing these different listening models in that sort of context, you're the expert. So what's the best way to sort of like dive into this topic a little bit so that the people listening can? Now, every time you use the word listen now, I'm like, I use the word again. It's like Pee-wee's Playhouse. So you have so that I can be more effective. And like you mentioned, listening strategy. If I want to improve my listening strategy as opposed to my listening skills, how can I do that under the framing of these different listening models?
That's a great question. And without going into the details of all of those different listening models, because by now there are many more that are out there as well, one of the important things to recognize is that in its most basic form, the models could be put into 2 categories. One category includes a response, and the other category does not include a response. So what would we call a response? Within the context of communication, a response sometimes is just seen as a thought, and in other times, an action or a verbal response would be required for that. And kind of let me give you an example that I heard from somebody that I was coaching once. He said, I realized early on in my marriage that responding verbally was going to be very important to my wife, because we were standing at the freezer and she pulled out a roast and she said, I think we'll have a roast tonight. And he said, I knew exactly what she meant, so I didn't say anything. And she dropped the roast on my toe. And I said, why did you do that? And she said, you weren't listening to me. And he's like, I know exactly what you said. And she said, well, how would I know that? So he recognized that some type of verbal response would be very important. And I think when we talk about the context of a sales team, sales meeting, what we oftentimes forget is within the context of communication, face-to-face communication, or now these days, virtual communication, some type of response is needed so that the speaker recognizes what the listener heard and understood from. So you had asked me about some of the process of listening. You could come to a lecture and take so much away from the lecture, but if you never talked to the person who was lecturing, he or she wouldn't know what you took away from it. So when we talk about a sales meeting, obviously everybody's got to be on the same page, as we call it. And the only way that we know if people are on the same page is if they use some of those individual skills, like paraphrasing. So Scott, if I heard you correctly, we need to do this, this, that by then. And then you, Scott, have the opportunity to say to me, you got that mostly right, but this is actually the when, not the one you said. But so often in sales meetings, what we do is I will just say, okay, team, we're going to do this and we're going to do that and we're going to do it by this time. And if I don't check for understanding with the people who were there, everybody walks away with a different idea of what was understood and what people are supposed to do. The most recent statistic that I heard is we spend 17.5 hours per week of our 40-hour work week clarifying miscommunication.
Wow. So clarifying in the sense that perhaps you sent me an email or we had a call and there was some misunderstanding of what I thought you said and what you thought you said and all that other, like what you said, what you meant and all those things. And so to unravel that or to get to a place of clarity, like, oh, you said this thing, I thought you meant that. You're saying we're spending 17 and a half hours just doing those tasks.
Exactly. And worse, to add to that, is sometimes I will complete a project based on what I thought I heard, and I will bring that project to you as my boss and say, here, Scott, isn't this great what I've done? And you look at it and you go, Laura, that's not what I asked you to do. So now we've got all of my work hours that were just lost because I worked totally on an incorrect project.
Yeah. I'm thinking about myself just internally within our team. We had a small project that I handed over to Matt, who's on my team, and I said, "Look, this is what I'm looking for. This is what we got to do." And then he went and built it, and it was in the direction of what I was looking for, but a lot of the spirit of what I intended was missing. So I'm like, okay, so that part of it is good, like the foundation of it is good, but the other 80% is actually way off, and we had to shift, and I had to do a better job of communicating, and this was through through some video and through some typing to clarify, to your point, like this is actually what I meant when I said I wanted this thing. So as soon as you said that, it made sense to me. So if I'm in a sales situation, like you use this technique, if that's the right word to call it, of paraphrasing. So is that an example of something we can do as a listening strategy to make sure that we're communicating on the same page?
That is one example of a listening strategy, and then I'm going to add another element to this in terms of that idea of listening intelligence. What our research has shown within the past couple of years is that people select and process information differently, and differently primarily in 4 different ways, 4 different habits. So this idea that listening as a habit is really important because it means that we can change the way that we listen. It's unlike our personality, which is often measured through Myers-Briggs or other tests like that. We can't change our personality. So today I'm a college professor, but tomorrow if I wanted to go into accounting, I would still have my same personality no matter how long I worked there. But if I went into accounting tomorrow, I would learn to listen differently because what you have to listen for in accounting would be very different than what I'm currently listening for today. So listening is a habit, and we do it subconsciously, and most of us don't recognize that we have listening blind spots. So we're not listening in all of those 4 different habitual ways that people can listen.
And what are those 4 ways?
The 4 ways, first of all, we've got the connective listener, and the connective listener listens and processes the information based on how it affects the people. So it could be the people inside, it could be the people outside. So in your sales teams, the connective listener is going to be listening to the information about how it affects the customers or the potential clients out there. The second type of listening habit is called the reflective listener. The reflective listener is more like a computer, kind of like you identified yourself earlier when you said you had your hard drive in your mind. The reflective listener goes through his or her past experience and tries to relate the words that they've selected and are listening to through their past experience. Do I have any past history doing something this way? If I did, what worked, what didn't work? How did I feel about it? If I were going to do it again, how might I do it differently? Because they're processing through their past experience, just like a computer, it takes a little bit of time to process. So oftentimes the reflective listener does not like to respond until they're fully processed, which could take up to 24 hours, if not longer. So that's why sometimes you've got people who are in meetings who are very quiet and don't say anything and probably don't have a lot of eye contact with other people, but they are processing this information and they come to you 24 hours later with this well thought out plan covering areas that the team never even talked about or discussed yesterday because they had to run it through their past experience. So that's the reflective listener. The third and fourth, I actually like to call the difference between the forest and the trees. The trees are the analytical listeners, and the analytical listeners routinely listen for the specific facts. They love the numbers, so things like percentages and deadlines. That's what they're listening for, and they're also listening for the credibility behind those facts. Who said that? Where did we get that information from? It's almost as if they can't see the big picture until they nail down all of the facts of today. The conceptual listener, on the other hand, is really interested in tomorrow and beyond. The conceptual listener is what we typically would think of in terms of a brainstormer or the possibilities person. They get the big idea of what's being discussed, and then they start thinking about how this can be applied in the future. So you can see right away if your team has an analytical listener and a conceptual listener, they're going to often be at odds because the conceptual listener is trying to apply this idea in the future, and the analytical listener is going, but wait a minute, today we only have this much money and we only have this many man hours and we only have these. So these are the restrictions that we have.
All right, we are off and running in my conversation with Laura Janusik. So quick hello to you. If you are a first-time listener, thank you so much for listening to the podcast. If you are a serial offender, it's good to have you here. I want to make sure that whether or not we know each other or whether or not you've come across the podcast before, I want to make sure you know what we do here at Sales Qualia. So everything that we do here at Sales Qualia is designed to help tech startups, B2B startups, to ramp up and scale up their sales process. So what exactly does that mean? Well, most startups that we work with are at either the seed stage or Series A round. And one of the biggest challenges a lot of those companies have is they've been able to build a base of revenue and customers, and they've gotten some product problem fit. What we're trying to do is get some repeatability and scalability in your sales process. So whether you need to grow to the first million in recurring revenue or get to the next couple million in recurring revenue so that you can really start to scale and make an impact in your business, we run a coaching program called Startup Selling that might be able to help you out. So if you want some help and you want to learn more about what we do, the easiest thing to do is to head over to Sales Qualia, Qualia.com. Easiest thing to do is either download a copy, grab a free copy of my most recent book, Stop Hustling, Start Scaling, add yourself to our email list. That's two options that you can do. And once you do that, we'll keep you in touch and let you know of the opportunities that we've got to help you and your teams. Third thing you do is just send me an email directly, Scott, SCOTT @salesqualia.com. And just in the subject line, write the word private. And what we'll do is tell you and share with you all of the details about how the team and I can work with you and your team to help you ramp up and scale up your sales at your B2B startup. So that's it for now. Let's head back to my conversation with Laura Janusik. Okay, so if we have these these are listener types, is that the correct nomenclature?
They're actually listening habits.
Listening habits. Okay, I want to make sure I'm getting this right. So you have these 4 listening habits. One of the things you said is that it's a habit. Therefore, I can start doing more of something or stop doing something that I'm doing that I don't want to do. So I guess like number one, how would somebody know which of these 4 are? And is it a good practice to try to be all of these 4 types as a habit? If I realize like I'm not very good as an analytical listener and I should do something to strengthen that, like should I try to be a well-rounded listener and be like good at all of them, or should I just play to my strengths because I'm good at being connective and that's just the way it is? Like, how do you think about that from a practical standpoint?
This is where it gets really strategic when we talk about sales or just business in general. One of the things that we can do is we can take a test, which is called the Echo Listening Profile, which is developed by Echo Intelligence, so they can identify which of those four are your strengths. And there are a number of different certified practitioners across the country and actually around the world that can help with that test. But you get a profile back, and the profile does tell you if you're single dominant in one of those areas or if you're multiple dominant. And you can actually be dominant in all four areas. So going back to your question, is it a good idea to have all four of those habits? And the answer to that is yes, because strategically you need to know which habit is best for the situation. Part of that situation is your client. If your client, let's take the example of a financial advisor, right? A financial advisor is in sales. And financial advisors, when you think of financial advisors, which type of listening do you think they would be most interested in?
I would guess probably connective.
Actually, analytical. They love those numbers,
okay.
right? Because they're financial advisors, right? I am not. My dominance is not primarily analytical. So I was just looking for a new financial advisor, and I actually interviewed 3 of them. And 2 of them just came at me hard with the numbers and what I would earn by going with them and all of the different investment options that I would have and things like that. And it just totally overwhelmed me because that's not what I was most interested in. I don't care about that stuff so much, and I don't primarily listen that way. What I wanted to do first was be connective, right? Get to know me as a person, get to know what my goals are. Let's talk about people and feelings. And so when I was hit with all of those numbers, that was a total turnoff to me. So recognizing who your client is and how your client is speaking is very important, because then you can not only listen from that habit, but you can then begin to speak to their habit. So if these 2 financial advisors that I interviewed were skilled in echo, they could have switched to connective because they would have heard some of the words that I was using, which includes pronouns, we, us, they, people kind of things, people and emotions.
Okay. So that actually leads me to like the next question that I wanted to ask you, which is how do we, because I guess I'm trying to think about maybe I have multiple questions here. This is so interesting. So you describe these financial advisors, 2 of them being very analytical, as listeners. It seemed like you came to that conclusion based on their behaviors, not their listeners. So do we have a tendency to act behaviorally in accordance with our listening skills? Is that like a signal?
Yeah, and I'm actually going to add a third thing in there. All of these things affect each other. How we think affects the way that we listen, and it also affects the way that we speak. How we speak affects how we think and how we listen, and how we listen affects how we speak and what we think. So all 3 of those things are highly intertwined. So we can be investigators and listen to the way that people are speaking to identify more so how they're thinking and what their listening dominance might be.
So if I am using your financial advisor example, if I was, like you said, skilled in identifying, what habit that you, Laura, the potential client, was most apt to be, then the suggestion here is that I could alter the way that I'm communicating with you in a way that would allow us to be more in sync.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. Okay. More in sync and on the same page. And then that financial advisor could slowly take me more to the analytical, but not bombard me with it in the beginning, because that was not what was important to me.
Got it. So you mentioned the connective listener tends to use pronouns like us and we. what would be, like, if I was just doing a quick litmus test on someone I just met, what would be an example of how could I potentially detect if somebody is a reflective listener?
Reflective listeners, because they process through their past experiences, will oftentimes use the pronoun I. I'm not ready to move forward yet. I don't agree with that. I don't think we can do something like that. They'll sometimes use we in terms of speaking for their team, even though their team may or may not be behind them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Because they're basing on their personal experience based on your definition of it. And
Exactly.
so therefore they would use that first person perspective on things. Okay. The analytical, is that just somebody who tends to use lots of facts and figures in the example you described?
Not only do they use facts and figures, but they consistently ask for those facts and figures. So Scott, how many cents did you say was on there? I don't want you to round it up. Just tell me exactly what the number is, so very precise that way with the realities or the truths of today. What are the facts of today? And they want to know those facts down to the decimal point or the detail. Whereas the conceptual listeners are about tomorrow and beyond. So they're the ones who are talking in terms of possibilities. Who might we partner with? What would happen if we offered you these two different options, right? So you're talking about more than something that is real today.
Got it. So when we did my echo assessment, which you mentioned you mentioned people that are professionals at doing this, you being one of those people. So we did our echo assessment, or did it for me, and we found that I was double dominant. Do you remember this?
I do. And do you remember what you were double dominant in?
I think I was double dominant in connective and analytical, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. Which makes perfect sense for what you do.
And how so?
Because you need to be able to connect with people. Actually, is connective yours? Do you mind if we take a quick break? I want to look yours up again.
I was going to look it up myself. So
because
you're right. I'm actually not. I'm the opposite. I'm double dominant and reflective and conceptual.
Right. And that's why we talked about, so you're double dominant and reflective and conceptual, which means that you're constantly combing through your past experiences. So when you're coaching somebody, you're going through your past experiences to see what you might say. But you are also so driven about the future in the same vein. So you're not willing to just settle for your accomplishments today and have things just stay the same. You want to build a better mousetrap, so to speak. So that's your future self as well. So as a consequence, one of the things that perhaps you don't do as much of is connect with people with emotions with your clients, right? And that could cause a little bit of friction because they might perceive you as just not being a caring person, whereas you just care about different things.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like of the 4 scores, I scored the lowest on connective. And I remember we joked about this, like when we run these big client events 2 or 3 times a year. And, I'll give people hugs or high fives, but it's not like there's other people like you can't help but hug them. And I'm just a little bit more, I don't know, people just don't approach me that way.
Yeah.
And I'm okay with it. I'm like totally comfortable with it. It's just who I am. But when I try to do those things, it actually feels a little bit forced. Even if it's somebody I really know well, I just feel like I'm not as comfortable doing that as some other people are.
And that's a habit. And I would say that if you practiced hugging people on a regular basis, you would become much more comfortable with it. So
as long as I get their permission.
Yes. Can I do a little experiment with you that I just learned,
I would
which
love
is
to do
so
this.
fun?
This would be great.
Actually, put your hands at your side and shake them out. And then I want you to cross your arms in front of you. Now look down, and which arm is on top?
My left.
Your left. Okay. So that's kind of what was comfortable for you, right? Now put your arms down, shake them out.
Oh, I know what you're going to do. Okay.
Yeah, and make your right go on top. Whoops. And so you have to
it feels
look.
Weird.
Now if you do that,
think about it too.
Yeah, now try it 3 times. Shake them out, cross right on top. shake them out,
Okay.
cross right on top. And one more time, shake them out, cross right on top.
Yeah, the third time it was like, I had to think about it, but it was like, it was conscious incompetence. So I was like kind of going from conscious incompetence to conscious competence.
Competence, yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And that's why when we practice listening through the different habits, at first it feels really uncomfortable because it's like any other physical skill that we adapt to or learn. I used to play softball, and as they say, I would throw the ball like a girl. And then my coach taught me how to throw the ball, and I can't tell you how uncomfortable that felt. It just felt like it was wrong. And it took me a good 2 months of throwing the ball under the coach's eye to be able to throw it more appropriately. I never got really good at softball, but I definitely did develop that skill. And that's the same thing with our listening as well.
Okay, so let's continue this thought process. Like if I'm I'm running my own company here, or somebody listening, they might, let's say somebody's sort of like me, or maybe they're an analytical thinker, but they score really low on the connective side. Like, what are some things that I should be doing, using the habit? Like, I have no problems going out to the garage and doing a workout every day. I stay in that habit. And I know there's some things I need to do every day to get better. What are some things I should do, every day to become a more connective listener to the people around me? Because if you're leading a company, or even with some clients, you might find some clients are much more warm and they want that, close personal relationship. And if I'm not able to give it to them, they may be like, okay, these guys are really smart and they have good software, but they seem kind of standoffish. Right. It's like, no, I'm like totally, I'm not standoffish. I promise.
Yeah,
so
you're a nice guy. I'll vouch for you. You're a nice guy. So some of the things that you might want to do, this kind of goes back to research too, and something that's called metacognitive listening strategies. And that means how we think about how we listen and how we can think about doing it better. And when we talk metacognitively, we always have 3 different phases. We've got something that occurs before the listening event. So what I would coach you to do is I would give you a list of questions that a connective listener might listen for. So who's all involved in this project? How do they feel about the project? Questions that tap into the people and the feelings. And I'd ask you to review that list of questions before you went into the meeting. And I'd ask you to listen for those while you were in the meeting. So while you're listening for those, you're also naturally listening conceptually and reflectively, because that's what you do anyways. But now you've added this new thing that you're listening for, which are the people. And if the meeting doesn't give you the answers, then you can actually ask those questions in the meeting. And that means that everybody then has the benefit of the answers. And then after the event is just double checking to make sure that you had your questions answered and finding if you need to go to another source to get them verified in any way.
Okay, that makes good sense. Like, that's very practical, because I could, like, maybe it's the analytical side. Like, I've got Post-it notes in front of me. I just had a call with a CEO this morning, and before the call, I'm like writing down all these notes of questions I wanted to make sure to ask, just to make sure I was getting clear on their business and what they need and how I might be able to help them. And so just adding to that list a couple of these connective questions would then sort of like program me, just like the first few questions I write down are more analytical, for example, or more conceptual or reflective. It would program me to add on at least 1 or 2 questions that are connective.
Yes, that's absolutely correct.
Okay. And you could think about it the other way. Like, my score is really low in connective, but if somebody had like a low analytical score, they're not used to asking about facts or not listening for or providing credibility, then they should do the same thing, which is like, okay, going into this meeting, let me think about some analytical questions that are things I should be listening for.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. And I actually was working with a group live before we had the COVID-19. And what was so interesting was we were on the session where I was teaching them how to ask questions from their listening blind spots. And then we brought the group leader in, and I had asked the group leader to prepare a 5-minute presentation on something that the group was really working on and discussing. And then after she quit speaking, we took questions from the audience. And it was so funny to see the reactions of everybody in the room, where the guy who was typically very conceptual is now asking these very analytical questions. And it really changes the whole energy of the group, because of course, people laugh at first, like, Tim, you never ask questions like that. And even the leader was like, whoa, I would never expect that from him. So she had to really think things through a lot differently in terms of how she approached meetings to make sure that she was meeting all of the needs of her different listeners, and they were covering everything that they needed as well.
Yeah, so I was just thinking about the sales call meeting that we all do. It seems like it would be a good practice if I'm speaking to a group of people I've never met before. Maybe I've got like one person who's like my main point of contact, and they go, look, why don't you come in and do a meeting with my executive team? So I walk into this room, and it's already uncomfortable because I don't know the people in the room, even if I try to get some time with them, but I don't really know these people. I have no idea what kind of listeners they are. It seems like it would be an intelligent practice to go through these 4 listening types: connective, reflective, analytical, conceptual, and write out like 3 questions of each, and make sure throughout the course of that sales call, I'm asking those kinds of questions, so that regardless of if there's 5 execs, I'm hitting all of those people for their listening skills. Is that right?
Absolutely.
You're nodding your head vociferously.
Yes,
okay.
Yes, that is absolutely correct. And one of the things that I do, if I have the chance, is I'll go into a room before I speak, and I will individually talk to people, and I'll try to assess what they are, because that gives me a better idea kind of who I'm speaking to. Because sometimes I go into a room and they're all analytical, right? That's it. They just want the numbers. So I get rid of the stories that I had planned, and any of the emotional words, and I really hit the analytical stuff.
That's really interesting. Yeah, because like one of the things we teach in our other clients, like before that big meeting, right? You have 5 executives. You should try to get some time with some form of communication, like hopefully at least a 10-minute call before the big meeting, or at least like an email exchange of some kind, to get a sense for what questions do they have, what are they looking for. And that's just sort of a proper sales preparation. But adding to this, like looking for these signals, even in an email, they might share some information that's a signal, and you might be wrong. I mean, none of us are going to be experts at this, but at least you could like listen for the listening type, so to speak.
Yes.
And then, like I said, going in there with these questions primed, like have 3 or 4 questions of each of these types. Make sure you run through at least one of them, and that just becomes your habit. And that will also improve my skill, because now I'm practicing being a connective listener, even though for me it might feel weird and uncomfortable. There's probably chances are that at least one person in that room is a connective listener. And even though I'm not, they go, oh, wow, that's great. He asked this great question, and that was related to like us and the team and we.
Yeah. And isn't it great when you can get everybody in the group unanimously saying that you're a great guy? And they may be saying this for different reasons, but you've got them all then.
Well, that's true, though. I mean, you think about, like, put ourselves in the other way. Like, if you've had a group, you've been one of the group, and someone from the outside comes in. Let's say you came in and did a group presentation for 15 people, and you didn't know their listening types, and we didn't know you, and you left. There'd be like 10 of us like, wow, she was awesome. And there might be a person or two like, I don't know, she kind of rubbed me the wrong way. You're like, what are you talking about? She was awesome.
Yeah.
And it could be only because you didn't align with their listening type. Is that right?
That is absolutely correct. And I like how you use the term align, because it is aligning with those different listening dominances.
Okay, this is awesome. So what other sort of piece of advice or strategy we give to somebody, whether they're out there selling to customers or working with their teams? What's something we haven't covered that is like a key thing that most people should be doing that they're not doing right now?
Well, this opens up a whole new can of worms for you. It goes back to this whole idea that listening is a cognitive habit, but in our culture, we perceive it behaviorally. So here's something that's going to blow your mind. When you think of listening behaviors, when you think, oh, she's really listening to me, what does that mean to you? What are you looking at?
Well, for me personally, I'm looking for, I see where you're going with this now already. I'm looking for eye contact. I'm looking for even nonverbal cues or verbal cues like, okay, that makes sense. Keep going. Sort of prompts. I'm looking for just are they leaning in? Or are they, all of a sudden they were standing relaxed and now their arms are crossed, or vice versa. So I think I know where you're going. So
so here's the part to blow your mind then. There's absolutely no research that supports that any of those nonverbal and even verbal listening behaviors are tied to any type of cognition or thought process. And it makes perfect sense because all of us can think back to being students and we figured out how to fake listen. Right?
Mm-hmm.
We sat in class and we maybe, like, I love when my students kind of look up like that was the wisest thing they've ever heard, but they're really thinking about what they're going to do on the weekend, right? Or the other student who's taking notes, but they're not really taking notes about what I'm saying. They're taking notes on their to-do list about what they have to do after class. So none of those nonverbals actually correlate in any way that we have been able to show through research so far with any of the cognitions. However, in the American culture, those nonverbals, what we often call active listening, is how we perceive other people to listen to us. So that's why listening becomes much more strategic, because the person who looks like they're being a good listener may not have anything going on in their brain at all. And that's
and
why.
vice versa.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because the reflective listener is the one who oftentimes will sit with arms crossed, looking off at the horizon. I suspect it could be because eye contact would distract them from processing. And so you're a pretty good eye contact person right now in doing this. But do you, when you're listening, do you establish eye contact or do you kind of look away?
I tend to look, but there are times when, especially if I'm processing information, I'll just kind of like look out the window and I am listening, and I'll even catch myself. I mean, I do this around the house, right? If I'm doing something in the kitchen, for example, my wife comes in and she asks a question, I might continue to do things, not make eye contact, and I'll say, I'm listening. And I'll actually verbalize, like, I am listening to you, just so you know I'm listening. I'm just doing something else. Now, sometimes I really am, and sometimes I might be lying to myself and say that I'm listening. I'm really not. Who knows? But no, I tend to do a little bit of both. I mean, I try to do eye contact just because that's, what I believe to be good social practice.
Mm-hmm.
And it partially is like a presence focus thing. Like if I'm looking at you, then I'm less likely to be checking messages or watching my son out in the backyard play, right?
Yeah.
And so if I remove those by putting blinders on, by looking at you, then it improves my chances of making sure that I'm listening.
Yeah.
Now, just because I'm doing that doesn't mean my mind doesn't wander.
Mm-hmm.
Which I definitely catch I'm like, wait a minute, I'm looking right at this person. I'm trying to be engaged, but my brain is not there. It's like somewhere else.
Yeah. So you've totally tied into it. So the nonverbals do not correlate with what's going on in our brain, but yet in our culture, we put so much weight on the nonverbals where we shouldn't be, particularly in business situations, because you can go into a room with 5 different executives and do your pitch. And let's say that they're all smiling at you and kind of nodding their heads, and you get to the question part, and I bet you hate when they don't have questions, right?
Of course. Yeah. You want them to, that's proof that they're engaging.
Exactly. But if they don't have questions, but they were all nodding, smiling, and taking notes, you might leave thinking, I really knocked that out of the park. Nobody had any objections at all. They must really like this idea, and then they come back with a big no. So you looked at the nonverbals as opposed to tried to figure out what was going on cognitively with them.
Yeah, and anecdotally, I remember situations where I've been in that room and there's the one executive that seems listless and not paying attention, and they push their chair back and they put their hands between their knees, and you're just like, man, that person's really bored. And then afterwards, they're the ones that come right up to you. For example, like, wow, that was really good. Like, I think we could use it here, here, and here. Mm-hmm. Or the next day they send you the email. And I've had situations like you described where clients are like, yeah, we went in, we did this great presentation, everybody was engaged, and now we can't get them to call me back. And I'm usually of the mindset, well, it's probably something in the sale. Maybe they weren't qualified in the first place and they're just being nice. Or maybe it was just like you didn't communicate in a way that aligned with their listening habits. So you said all the things that they needed to hear, but they didn't listen to it the way that you wanted them or they needed to.
Exactly. You said that beautifully, so I can't even say it better.
Well, and I think the other thing, as you were talking about this behavioral aspect of listening, I think about my son, right? He's 8, and he's still learning how to listen in the sense like, look, we got to talk. And he's messing around the house. He's still playing with his toys or messing around with the cats. And I'm like, look, I got to, like, we need to talk. He's like, I'm listening. And and my wife would even say, look, he's fine. Just tell him what you need to tell him. He doesn't have to be looking at you. Because that's what my dad would do. Like, no, you have to sit here and you have to listen to me and look at me in the eye. And there's other times where I'll ask him to look me in the eye and he's just like, give me the eye roll. And he doesn't know. And he's just like, I'm like, you're not listening to me. He's like, yes, I am. It's just because he hasn't been conditioned to listen socially in the social parameters that we've been learned means listening. So what you're telling me, all that stuff's out the window. And what really matters is identifying whether or not somebody's one of these 4 listening habits.
Well, not necessarily out the window, because I wouldn't suggest that we throw convention out the window. So I think social convention is really important, but we also have to recognize that is very cultural too. So for example, there are a couple of cultures where eye contact is extremely disrespectful. You would never look a superior in the eye, which would include a parent or a boss. Right? Or you would never disagree openly with a parent or a boss. I work with people who are project managers who manage teams that have people from different cultures on them. And it's always very interesting because particularly the cultures that have a lot of hierarchy there, the person who's doing the work isn't going to disagree with the boss publicly, even though the boss is not giving the correct information. So the project manager is not getting the correct information, but there are reasons for that.
Yeah. Wow, you give me lots to work on. And I think the people listening, no pun intended.
Or pun intended.
I think the same, or pun intended. Well, look, this is why, like, after we first met, one of my first thoughts was we should have you on the podcast because, as I said at the start of our conversation, I didn't know what you did was a thing. I didn't know listening strategy even existed. And as I've learned more about it and going through my assessment that you did with me, and then just through this conversation, it's created this better awareness that there's these different listening habits, that there's things I can do specifically to improve in places where I might be less dominant. And that there's like an opportunity, I think, for all of us to just separate what we think is good listening versus actual good listening. And that I think that's going to raise like emotional intelligence and listening intelligence all across the board. So this has been really cool. This has been fun working with you on this over the last couple of weeks. So we mentioned the Echo. What's the precise name for it? The Echo Listening?
Echo Listening Profile, or Echo Listening is the company. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you're one of the experts in the world that can provide and then analyze these. And you've done this with me individually. We've talked about having you do that with our team internally. So if somebody was interested in contacting you or learning more about this, what's the best place that they should go to learn more about Echo, to learn more about your work, and maybe even have you come in and help them with their team?
Yeah, they can contact me directly. So linking with me on LinkedIn is probably the best thing to do. Laura Janusik, Jan as in Nancy, US as in Sam, IK. Or they can go to the Echo Listening website and they can request information there. And I'd certainly appreciate if they put my name in there too. That's how they heard about it. Because then they don't actually do any of the training themselves. The certified practitioners do the training. And some of the certified practitioners do have a background in listening and research, and some do not. So that is something to consider as well. How important is that research aspect to you and the team? So they can either contact me through LinkedIn or they can go to the Echo Listening website.
Okay. We'll just send them all to your LinkedIn profile.
Perfect.
Well, this has been great. Thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your genius here, your superpower with everyone listening. I think this has been a really solid dose of new perspective for people. So many times in our podcast, we talk about, how to hire salespeople and how to prospect the right way, and so all those tactical stuff, and to get into some real, guts of like good, effective communication. It's been a lot of fun. So thanks for taking the time to join here.
Thanks so much, Scott. It was my pleasure. It was a lot of fun.
Cool. We'll have to do it again. So, all right, Laura, we'll let you get on with your day. Appreciate the time.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. See ya. Bye.